thank you so much for showing up early. I was joking with Rip earlier that it's actually a great spot to be one of the very first sessions where everybody is still hungry for ideas. They're not yet burnt out. They are eager to get the best experience possible for the Ideas Festival. And so Rip and I will take very seriously our obligation to start you off in the right way. A few housekeeping notes. Please silence your phone. Yeah, we didn't plan that, but it does work out quite well. Silence your phone. We do encourage people to tweet or engage on social media. If you hear something from us that you think should be shared with the world, or if there is a question, if you want to tweet it and use the hashtag AspenIdeas. And if you want to leave comments about this session, I hope only nice comments, but all comments are welcome in the app. That helps the organizers plan for and create a better experience for future Ideas Festivals. And now I'll introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Bradley. I'm the director of the Center for Urban Innovation at the Aspen Institute. The center's purpose is to connect the innovation conversation that happens in cities with the inclusion conversation that is starting to happen in cities, so that as cities drive towards creativity and innovation, they do so in a way that helps cities fulfill their promise of being places of opportunity for everyone, for all of their residents. And with me this morning is my friend and teacher, Rip Rapson, who is the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation. And we're here to talk about what cities are doing now to advance the promise of opportunity, and how cities are maybe a little bit different than you think they are. We jokingly said that this session was going to be called What Your Mayor Isn't Telling You. And as we open, you might think that a conversation on cities would be best had with a mayor or somebody that we traditionally identify as a city leader. Rip, you have been a deputy mayor, but right now you're a philanthropic leader. Why is it important to include philanthropy and other kinds of institutions in conversations about the future of cities?
Can I take that question and turn it inside out for just a second? Because I was in a conversation just a couple days ago with the folks from the Bloomberg Philanthropies. And of course, Mayor Bloomberg enters any community through a mayor, and to a spectacular result. I mean, they do everything from planning to arts to economic development in a way that you can only sometimes through a mayor. But I think our experience in Detroit, and increasingly in other communities, is that model is increasingly more resembling almost a magnetic field. That there's clearly a strong, powerful pull to the center, even in the most weak mayor systems in our country. But increasingly, there are a lot of particles arrayed around that field. And when you actually think about how a city works, it's not just the core of the magnetic field, it's the entire thing. And I think what we've found in Detroit in particular, and we can talk more about it, is that the mayor, at his or her most effective, is understanding how to sort of array those particles. It's a ridiculous mixed metaphor. Magnetic field doesn't particularly care where those particles lie, but if it did, it would actually increasingly begin to certify questions for which all of those component parts had a role in helping solve. And so I think what we're seeing in American cities at their best is an increasingly distributive model of how you problem solve and how you sort of reconstruct possibilities for the future for all sorts of reasons. I mean, and folks in this room can also speak to this. We have a lot of people in the room who have spent their entire careers in the public space, but I think that we are seeing a very different model emerge, particularly outside of the traditionally strong market communities, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the Chicagos. And in some of those sort of second and third and fourth tier cities, a very different way of coming at problem solving, I think, is beginning to emerge.
So when I think about this new model of problem solving, my reference point is the Detroit bankruptcy. A lot of great stuff has been written about the Detroit bankruptcy and how people in every sector, from the judges who were kind of making decisions, particularly around what was called the grand bargain, which had to do with how the city could both protect its jewel of an art collection and fulfill its promises to pensioners. A lot of different constituency groups were at the table, but you've said that the new way of working, this kind of distributed problem solving, this magnetic field, predates bankruptcy in Detroit. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
You know, it's really tempting to look at the Detroit bankruptcy and the 2012-13 period and think that this was just this extraordinary, once-in-a-generation drop down of philanthropy into this really complicated set of problems. As you mentioned, Jennifer, there was sort of the need to figure out how to make sure the pensions weren't impaired because the state constitution protected pensions. There was the need to not have the art of the Detroit Institute of Art sold to satisfy creditors because there was an argument that that was held in public trust. And had you not been able to resolve those two issues, we would have been in litigation in Detroit for a decade. And Detroit really would have gone to a very unfortunate place. It probably wouldn't have survived in many ways. And so it's tempting to sort of look at the infusion of philanthropic capital in this grand bargain as this sort of extraordinary enter stage left of philanthropy. But in fact, what had happened was in the previous 5 or 6 years, dating really from the 2008-2009 recession, philanthropy had really stepped up in a very different way in Detroit because it had to. For those of you who don't know the Detroit circumstance, in 2008-2009, this very charismatic mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, elected at age 31, very larger-than-life kind of figure, was essentially convicted of corruption, and he and 38 of his best friends went to the federal penitentiary. 2008-2009 also happened to be the time when Detroit, like every other city in America, was struggling through the recession. And in 2008-2009, the autos were in bankruptcy. And so when you put those sort of vectors together, it was just a calamity that was almost unimaginable. And
Can you speak up just a bit? So not everybody's
all right, sorry, should I? Let me also do that.
Yeah.
Is that better? No, same. How about in the back? Is that all right?
Great.
Fine, okay, good. And so philanthropy really had no choice but to sort of step up and try to understand whether it couldn't play some kind of stabilizing role. I mean, philanthropy can't substitute for the public sector, it can't substitute for the private sector, but it could create scaffolding that would hold firmly enough until those sectors regain their rightful role. And so from 2008 to 2013, philanthropy went about the business of trying to understand what a suite of interventions might be that would help stabilize the city. So we created a new fund to diversify the economy through small business development. We started, of all things, a light rail project in which the public and the private and the philanthropic sectors all came together to try to create the beginnings of a mass transit system in Southeast Michigan. We put together a major land use plan, something that had just bedeviled a city that was just afflicted with enormous blight and disinvestment, on and on and on and on. And so by the time we hit the bankruptcy, Jennifer, in 2013, philanthropy was used to working together. It was used to sort of getting out on the lead edge of something, understanding how it needed to work one to another, and it made the bankruptcy intervention much easier. I think the interesting question, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take your question, but the interesting question is whether that kind of assertive pre-bankruptcy role after a bankruptcy judgment is entered, after a new mayor is elected, continues to hold, because it was such an extraordinary circumstance. And I actually would argue that it does, that it's reset the table of how the sectors interacted and moved together to make progress in a way that you really can't go back. You can't go backwards from it. It really redefines how the sectors work together.
And you've also seen this in some of the work that we've done together in Fresno and Memphis, right? Mm-hmm. Cities that are in their own kind of crisis, but that's not punctuated by one easily recognized disaster like a Hurricane Katrina or a bankruptcy. So can you talk a little bit about how this is coming together in Fresno and Memphis?
Yeah. After the bankruptcy, I think the question we were most often asked, because we had spent tens and tens of millions of dollars and drawn in the Ford Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, and and lots of others, was whether this was such an unusual circumstance that it was really limited to the Detroit experience. And so we actually went about the business of testing that proposition. We convened 20 or 25 cities in Southern California to sort of ask that question. Is there anything that comes out of this experience that might be useful to you, that might help you sort of reimagine how your community would work going forward? And we were actually surprised, because the answer was essentially yes. That whether it was the small business strategy, or whether it was the land use strategy, or whether it was the community engagement strategy, there were bits and pieces of the Detroit experience that seemed to have real relevance to these other communities. And once you got beyond the sort of the disbelief that any city really looked like Detroit at all, what you realized is almost all of our cities look like Detroit to some extent. Income disparity, broken education systems, inadequate mass transit, inadequate connection to suburban job opportunities and the like. And so we actually began a project in which Jeffrey's referring to. We asked the national policy think tank community to think, what would it look like if we went into Fresno, Memphis, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and asked the question, what are the issues you're struggling with that seem most intractable? And is there anything in this national constellation of technical analysis, policy analysis, data accumulation, or direct investment on the part of something like Kresge that would actually be helpful? And what we found, again, was this sort of remarkable affirmation that these tools actually could be used in these communities in a way that they hadn't been before. And so we started something called a shared prosperity partnership, in which the Brookings Institution, the Urban Institute, Aspen, Living Cities, and Kresge would go into these communities, have these conversations, and try to array our resources in a way that might be helpful to them. So a long way of saying, in a place like Fresno, where there has traditionally been, how to describe it politely, sort of a failure to sort of anticipate the changing demographics of essentially a California agrarian economy, new demographic shifts, traditional power structures that no longer really serve the community. The question was, could we actually move into Fresno with this sort of consortium of folks and begin identifying ways in which external resources could help them sort of break out of very conventional ways of thinking? And so the answer is yes, and we can talk more about it. But it has much to do with this notion of distributive leadership. That if you go in, I think I saw Kate Levin come in. I'm from the Bloomberg folks. Kate, plug your ears. If you go in only through the mayor, then it sort of limits your options in a place like Fresno. But if you go in through a community foundation or through a consortium of private sector actors who are interested in sort of reconfiguring how they interact with the mayor's office, you get a very different alchemy of problem solving, and I think that's what we're seeing in Fresno.
And I wonder if a common thread among all of this is the power of networks, right? And this notion of distributed leadership. We're seeing this, right? I imagine that if you were to do, this metaphor is not going to go well. If you were to do like a bingo card, right, and every time somebody said network at the Aspen Institute, you would very quickly get a full bingo, or you'd fill out your card. We're learning that innovation and idea generation comes through networks. So not only have you described a network of actors within a city, like Detroit or Fresno, you've also described a network of actors coming in to support a city. And certainly looking at Bloomberg Philanthropies, they think about networks, creating networks of cities, right? Through I-Teams, through What Works Cities, some of their stuff. So the idea that's strongly emerging is that no one actor or no one city has all of the answers that they need. So they need to draw on this larger realm of resources. And one of the things that we've talked about in this is the difference between trying to change systems in cities and politics in cities. That there are certain pressures of politics that mitigate against the kind of deep systemic change that will make cities stronger and more opportunity rich. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you've been really on the front lines of some of those differences between systems change and political pressures.
Well, it seems so basic that any American contemporary city needs lots of folks sort of working on its problems, right? Whether it's education reform or diversification of the economy or building wealth in communities of color. And so on one hand, not a particularly interesting idea. You need the private sector, you need the public sector, you need the philanthropic sector, you need the nonprofit sector, the community sector. But when the rubber hits the road, it actually gets quite complicated. Maybe since Mayor Duggan is not in the room, I can talk about Detroit. Although we are on film, aren't we?
Yeah.
I don't think he watches TV. After the bankruptcy, we elected Mayor Mike Duggan, a really strong, smart mayor. Those of you who know Mayor Landrieu in New Orleans, very much like Mayor Duggan. And Mayor Duggan came in with sort of everything on full throttle and began working at land use and blight and housing opportunity and all sorts of things. But it became clear that he had neither the resources nor the talent base when he began to really get this stuff done. And so he began sort of very selectively and thoughtfully trying to pick off folks from the community who could help solve commercial corridor revitalization problem or a housing fund or whatever it was that he wanted to put together. So far, so good. And in many ways, in the early stages of the mayor's administration, those pieces sort of fell in place and locked in place pretty readily. But as the sort of the maturity of the recovery in Detroit has begun to take form, it's clear that the mayor needs to take credit for this stuff, right? And so increasingly, if something isn't going well, he's not particularly anxious to admit it, to recalibrate it, and to sort of go back to community and say, well, we got this wrong. We're going to do it differently this time, and we're going to reconfigure the actors. Similarly, when I think a mayor like Mayor Duggan, who is white in a community that is 90% people of color, has to sort of continually reassert that he's in charge, he's in control, that he's sort of the one marshaling the resources to make the community step forward. And again, back to the magnetic field, all of that is correct. But increasingly, there are just things that he can't reach, things that he absolutely needs Dan Gilbert of Quicken Loans to do, or the Kresge Foundation to do. And it's hard. I mean, that balance is hard. What happens if we disagree with his strategy? What happens if he wants sort of full carte blanche to sort of deploy our resources in a certain way, and we want to sort of parcel it in a certain way? Ultimately, the mayor holds the election certificate. Ultimately, he has to prevail. But the process of getting there actually gets quite complicated. And we've had a number of situations in which the mayor wants to go left. We think maybe going right makes more sense. Ultimately, we have to go left if he insists because he is the mayor. But the tension of trying to pull him a little bit more toward the right has actually been quite difficult. I don't mean to go on, but one quick example. During the pre-bankruptcy, Kresge essentially underwrote a land use planning process that was one of the most ambitious land use planning processes in American history. We involved over 100,000 Detroiters, hands-on, 4 years, working in very complicated ways to make sure that the community's voice was heard. At the same time, we brought in a whole suite of technical experts to sort of create this sort of tension between community and expertise, and ended up with a very robust land use plan called the Detroit Future City Plan. In the pre-bankruptcy period, that was enormously useful because no one was talking about land use and blight and how you can kind of move blighted property from the negative side of the ledger to the positive side. But once the bankruptcy sort of reset the table, once Mayor Duggan was elected, he came to us and said, all right, I'm going to build out a first-rate planning department, and he did. And so now the Detroit Future City Plan is ours, right? I said, no, I don't think that makes sense. It seems to me that what we've done is created a community-held framework for decision-making that, at least for a while, should probably stand outside of City Hall. Maybe over time, those two things merge. And he and his administration really made life miserable because they felt that we were competing with essentially their core competence. Now, they may have been right. Again, maybe we should have gone left. But my sense was that there was an opportunity through a sort of a third-party, independent entity sort of calling the question on hard questions of land use and resource allocation that over time might be useful for the city, that you actually would begin to triangulate some of the complex conversations of the city, and that we could always revisit the question in 3 or 4 years. Well, it was a really difficult time. I mean, we kind of got into a public spat about this. It shouldn't have seemed that important, but the possibility of holding multiple sort of sources of accountability to community at once became, I think, a real benefit for the city. And there have been times when the Detroit Future City Office actually has sort of challenged the mayor. Most recently, for example, it just issued an analysis of the African American middle class in Detroit. The mayor didn't want that report on the street. It was a little bit critical of the progress that hadn't been made, and yet it was factually grounded. It was analytically sound, and the possibility of opening up a different kind of conversation than we would have had that been held by the mayor and minimalized, I think sort of suggested that maybe sometimes you have to go right when the mayor wants to go left. And so that sort of objectivity and distance, I think, sometimes can be difficult.
So what are the kind of competencies that people, people in this room care about cities, they have professional and personal resources to devote to the well-being of cities. What are the kind of competencies we should be looking for in mayors and in other people in cities who can play that connective role, that accountability role? Is being an urbanist or a planner or a policy person qualitatively different in this distributed leadership, network, shared innovation, present and future that we're building?
That's an interesting question. I think it's less a question of disciplinary expertise than sort of adaptive competence. Again, forgive me, Kate, but Kate and I were talking a couple days ago about the extent to which Mayor Bloomberg's real skill is adaptation. I mean, he's brilliant technologically, he's a brilliant administrator in a lot of ways, but ultimately he has the confidence and the skill to sort of understand when you have to pivot, when you have to sort of take something, turn it around, and push it in another direction. And I think increasingly that adaptive capacity on the part of public officials becomes sort of the defining quality. I look again at someone like Mayor Landrieu. I mean, think of what had happened during the 10 years of Mayor Landrieu's administration. There was sort of no roadmap for that. There was a constant sort of adaptation, turning, picking up new resources. It was sort of a constant exercise in flexibility. And I think where mayors sometimes get in trouble is when they assume that in their sort of command and control structure, they don't have the latitude to adapt, admit that something isn't going well, draw in a third party. And I think that becomes, in some ways, the competence that a mayor uses best. If I can just use one more Detroit example. In 2010, Dan Gilbert, the head of Quicken Loans, everybody knows Gilbert?
Owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, also, for sports fans.
Cleveland?
Sorry.
I'm told it's a city to the east of Detroit. I'm not sure. Gilbert's headquarters were in Livonia, Michigan. I have no idea where Livonia, Michigan is, but it's somewhere outside of Detroit. And Gilbert basically said, as part of our affirmation that Detroit is worth investing in, we will move our headquarters into downtown Detroit. So this is 2010, again, right in the middle of the bankruptcies, the recession, and the political corruption scandals. And at the time, it seemed like an interesting move, but not a huge one. At that point, Quicken was not the sort of the behemoth that it is now. It had 1,700 employees. They go ahead and move into downtown Detroit. Well, 5 years later, they have bought 90 buildings, almost 12 million square feet, employ 14,000 people in downtown Detroit. And early on, it was really fascinating to watch the dance between Mayor Duggan and Dan Gilbert, who now is sort of creating a company town. And to the mayor's credit, I mean, he was pushing back, saying this is public space. We need to program it properly, Fred. We need to think in a creative way about how you manage private land ownership with public space responsibilities and moving through this space and transit and everything else. And it was not at all clear how this was going to work, because Gilbert is a privately held company. Quicken is a privately held company. They didn't even have to report to shareholders, to say nothing of the mayor, and he was purchasing up land as fast as he could. It was like a fire sale. And to Duggan's enormous credit, he and Gilbert finally ended up having a whole suite of sort of summits, mini summits, in which they talked about how the new city planning department could work with Gilbert's planners, how the infrastructure that Gilbert was seeking to build simply had to dovetail with the infrastructure that the mayor was charged with stewarding. And had the mayor simply just insisted on his prerogatives, it would have been a real disaster. I'm not sure what Gilbert would have done. I'm not sure what the mayor would have done. But for a while it appeared that we were in a stalemate, and it was serving no one's interest whatsoever. But because, and it seems again so basic, but because the mayor was willing to adapt and to think a little bit differently about how the question was proposed to him, he became, I think, a much more effective mayor as a result. I mean, to sort of think of it in the most simple terms. How that moves forward is really interesting. I mean, how Gilbert increasingly thinks of his role by way of the mayor's prerogatives, how the mayor thinks of his role by the way of Gilbert's prerogatives, is, I think, a sort of a defining question. We're seeing it in Memphis, we're seeing it in Fresno, we're seeing it in so many of these communities where there are these sort of cycles of influence, where one sector or another sort of rises to the top on a particular set of issues, only to sort of disrupt the other sectors. And how you sort of create that equilibrium is, I think, essentially the core competence of a modern city American mayor.
So are there city leaders or places that you're particularly excited about? I know that often I get asked, who's doing it right? What are the great examples? And I never know quite what to say, because it's like, well, who's doing it right on what metric? What does right look like? But are there particular leaders or places that you think are at least promising?
Well, just because the camera is still rolling, let me say, Mayor Duggan is doing it perfectly. Really good. And actually he is. He's quite a remarkable mayor. Let me pull an interesting example, if I could. And it seems kind of trivial, but in some ways, I think it becomes somewhat illustrative of some of the sort of the smaller second-tier cities of America. And that's Fresno. There was a mayor of Fresno for 8 years named Ashley Swearingen. And Mayor Swearingen realized that this traditional inland empire that had been sort of passed over by San Francisco and LA, was just sort of the hinterlands, was actually going to become critical to the future of Northern California. It sits right on a high-speed rail line. It employs, tens and tens of thousands of farm workers. Its population is diversifying not only in the Latinx community, but also in the Asian American community. It's a very complicated place, and no one ever pays any attention to it. It's like Stockton, Riverside, Fresno. Well, Swearingen happens to be this transcendently gifted public thinker. She went to work rezoning every parcel, sort of anticipating the rail line, beginning to move investment vehicles to sort of become adjacent to the rail line so that there would be a housing fund and a small business fund. She created a whole new set of relationships with the community that was increasingly sort of asserting its prerogatives, the Hispanic community. Just a brilliant sort of suite of moves. And she was term limited, and so she could do a lot in eight years. But ultimately what she tried to do was sort of set up the public sector to be porous, to have all sorts of really interesting consortium of folks helping define sort of the future of the city. Well, when she stepped away from office, it wasn't clear kind of what she would do. And so the Community Foundation, which is this teeny little community foundation in Fresno, grabbed her and said, why don't you come run the Community Foundation? Which all of a sudden became a huge headache for the next mayor, because you had this very high visibility person over here. And what Ashley has done, and this is not really answering your question, but what Ashley has done is to sort of position the Community Foundation as a sort of a full partner with the mayor. And to the mayor's credit, he sort of embraced that. And so all of a sudden, sort of extension of influence by other means, you have these two powerhouses sort of working together in a way that 10 years ago was unimaginable. I don't know that Ashley necessarily foresaw what her career would be after being mayor, but taking that long view and actually setting up your public institutions in a way that would be receptive to other parts of the community playing an important role, I think made Ashley a great mayor. And if you ever have a chance to listen to Ashley, she speaks a lot. She is really extraordinary. And I think whether it's Fresno or Memphis or any of these sort of second-tier places, that kind of public leadership is a very different model, I think, from the one we've had for a very long time.
Great. So I have time for one more question to you before we open it up to questions. And I warned you this was coming. What is the one thing that you think people should leave this room knowing about cities and the future and leadership? You could say 2 or 3.
I hesitate because I think it drives my friends from New York and Chicago and San Francisco crazy when I say stuff like this. But I actually believe that sort of the future of sort of equitable, inclusive economies in the United States is going to be created outside of our strong market cities. That there is almost an imperative of innovation, distributive leadership, trying sort of new tools and new combinations and in new doses that is almost inevitable in a place like Fresno or Detroit or Memphis or Cleveland or Kansas City or Milwaukee or El Paso. I mean, these are places that simply have to innovate in order to survive. There is not enough federal money on the planet to get them out of their circumstance, and their states are often hostile. And so the idea that working with scarce resources in these much more distributive ways sort of amplifies your ability to be responsive to what I think we all understand is sort of the next generation of challenge in America, which has to do with equity and inclusion and different demographics in the political system. Those are the kinds of things I would look to Fresno and Riverside and Stockton and El Paso and Phoenix and other places to figure out, because I think that's where the real innovation is coming. It's not that it's not in New York. I mean, what New York is doing day in and day out just sort of takes your breath away, or even in San Francisco with all of its troubles. But I think the really sharp-edged innovation is going to come at that sort of second level of America.
Great. Now we're going to open it up for questions. Before I call on anybody, just here's the rule when I'm the question taker. A question is a short statement that ends in a question mark. Generally, if you find yourself having to take a breath or two, you've probably moved into a kind of statement as opposed to a question. So please, so that we can get a broader mix, right, distributed ideas, please be sure that you are asking a question as opposed to making a statement. I hope I've usefully intimidated some people, and now I will call. Yours was the first hand I saw go up. Yeah.
Could you comment on?
Wait for the microphone. Sorry, didn't yet. Also wait for the microphone.
I left Detroit 38 years ago.
In
1980 when Chrysler was bankrupt. And there were no opportunities. I was a graduate of Hillsdale. Went to work in Washington, D.C. Comment on homecoming, because I've come back to Detroit. And have gotten involved very significantly in a opportunity there that touches on everything you just spoke about, the Recovery Park project, which we have achieved our funding. But comment on homecoming.
Great. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. The question asked about what's come to be called Detroit homecoming. This was cooked up, probably 6 or 7 years ago, after the bankruptcy had kind of settled a little bit. The idea was to try to get Detroit expats to come back and see that the city was a different place from when they had left 20 or 30 or even 10 years ago. And the expats of Detroit are actually impressive. I'm sure you're very impressive, but the yeah, the Ballmers are Steve Ballmer from Microsoft is an expat. I won't even go through them all, but it's actually extraordinary how many people have left Detroit. And so the idea that we could actually come back, showcase the progress that the city has made, and ask whether people wouldn't want to take a small piece of that. It's not just money. We've had people who have brought their families back to work on a habitat house. We've had people who have come back to invest in an urban garden. We've had people come back and locate an entire plant. I mean, it's actually sort of a wonderful construct. And so any of you who are from Detroit and would like to come back, homecoming is usually convened in the fall. It's 2 or 3 days of touring around the city, hearing from folks who are doing different kinds of work, and trying to highlight potential investment and engagement strategies. And those of you who aren't from Detroit, come anyway. When I moved to Detroit in 2006, there was an enormous amount of optimism. This was right after Kilpatrick had just gotten reelected. And the deflation that occurred, not the technical term, the letting the air out of the sense of hopefulness about Detroit that occurred from 2008 to 2013 was just profound. And yet this sort of scaffolding concept really helped. It really helped hold the city in a way that permitted it in 2013, when it emerged from bankruptcy, to do things that in many ways I think no American city has done. The level of innovation and the sharpness of the pivot in Detroit really takes your breath away. There are still huge problems. It's still a city of 700,000 people. It still has enormous poverty. Its educational system is abysmal, but there are points of leverage that are beginning to really take hold. And you probably could testify better than I, that for those who have not been back to Detroit in 10 or 15 years, it's a different city. You don't even recognize it. There are people on the street. There are young people of all ethnicities and races using the public facilities. It's really quite extraordinary.
Great.
That's a longer answer than you wanted, probably.
Here, and then we'll go to Bill, whose hand came up earlier.
Good morning. Good. It's on. Okay. Sorry.
Hi.
I live in Charlotte. I'm from El Paso. I used to live in Detroit, so
Oh.
the triangle. What do you think would be your take on the distrust? And in Charlotte we saw riots in 2017. Deep-seated historical distrust and hate that exists, and that I think keeps these cities, Charlotte, because I live there now, from really looking objectively, because there's just no trust.
Well, that really is the question, isn't it?
But I did ask a question.
Yes, you did. Absolutely, yes. Very solid questioners so far.
Could she make a statement rather than ask a question? It's way too hard. The level of alienation that we see in Detroit, and I've been to Charlotte, and I think I understand what you're saying. This prosperous, on the surface, everything looks fabulous in Charlotte, right? It's up and coming, and yet when you actually prick below the surface, it's a complicated place. You don't have to prick very far below the surface in Detroit to understand the level of alienation. And it just makes sense. When you have 35% of your population unemployed, 35 to 40% of our population is illiterate, the disparities are just stunning. And I think, this sounds so trite, but it just seems to me that once you've sort of stabilized your tax base, which was sort of Detroit's first challenge, we just didn't have enough tax base to provide public service that were adequate. So the Gilbert presence, the movement up our main avenue, The Illich family, which owns Little Caesars Pizza, go figure, invested in a new arena. All of the institutions all along the major corridor began sort of coming back. And there was an enormous sense in the neighborhoods that Detroit was coming back on the backs of the neighborhoods, that the neighborhoods were just being completely ignored in all of this. And to some extent, they weren't wrong. I mean, we had done a land use plan, we had done small business plans, we had done all sorts of things that sought to push investment into the neighborhoods. But what you needed was really a full pivot to say, all right, the market is back downtown and in Midtown, let it work. And now places like Kresge and Ford and others, the Ford Foundation, can begin investing in community capacity, in small business development along neighborhood commercial nodes, in educational restructuring in neighborhoods. And I think that has actually been one of the reasons you haven't seen the sort of the breakout of frustration and anger and hatred in Detroit that you may have seen in other places. Maybe we've just been fortunate and haven't had the kind of traumatic events that some other communities have had. But I also think what you're seeing is small statements of progress all throughout the neighborhoods of Detroit. And there's enough there, I think, to give people a sense that they actually can be heard, that money will move into the kinds of work that they want to do, and that over time you can create a flywheel of progress that may end up being much more inclusive. Now, that's not going to happen in 2 years. It's not going to happen in 5 years. But you've got to make enough progress just to suggest, it seems to me, to the neighborhoods and the residents in them and the small businesses in them that they have a future. Because if they don't see a future, obviously then you're going to get exactly the kind of continuing hatred that you suggest, or alienation.
And just briefly, is this where this notion of distributed leadership and a lot of different access points for change can help? There's not just one way to make change?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that the mayor, again, only has so many resources to sort of plug into the civic infrastructure of a community. But if Kresge can give $5 million to local organizations to re-grant for community improvement projects, which we have, if the Ballmer Group can put money into some really innovative next generation reclamation of housing projects, which they have, that can help. If the Ford Foundation can invest in small kind of movement building in the neighborhoods where people get organized around block clubs or around a park or around an educational site that they want to reclaim that's been closed, that can help. So I think you're right. I think if all you had was the opportunity, was the need to wait for Mayor Duggan to reach your neighborhood, I think that kind of alienation is going to be much, much sharper. And I just think now you can see 6 or 7 or 8 different ways in which neighborhoods can begin to sort of take control of their own decision-making, begin to sort of engineer their own projects, and to actually see progress on their terms.
Great. Bill, you've been waiting patiently. Sure. Wait for the microphone. Wait just a second more for the microphone.
Thank you.
Hi.
My question is about Fresno. When I think of Fresno, I think of their congressional representation in the U.S. Congress out of Clovis, which is Devin Nunes. And it raised the question in my mind, is there a place for participation on the bingo card from representatives at the state or federal level who come from the Detroits, Memphises, and Fresnos?
Should they play more of a prominent role?
Is there a role for them to play at all? I mean, you don't. I doubt you've ever thought of Devin Nunes as part of the Fresno experience, but he represents,
He does, huh?
100,000 people there or something.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Sorry.
No.
No, but that's the hard question, right?
It's really hard.
Is how this goes up and down the federalism ladder, and certainly in the work that I've been doing. I'm giving you time to think. I hope.
Yeah.
in the work that I've been doing on urbanism, there's always this tension, right, about how much to engage a federal government that often seems more, and this is not confined to one particular executive administration, right? Congress has for a long time seemed interested in making particular national level points and having lost contact with some of the issues at the local level. So I think what a lot of folks at the local level do is, federal interest can look like winning the lottery. It's great if it happens, but you can't count on it for your work. Now, an interesting point about Fresno specifically is that Ashley Swearingen is a Republican. And so she has that kind of political bilingualism that I think will serve her well, having to deal with a very firmly Democratic governor and a Republican populace. And then, so if anybody can do it, I think it's mayors who are able to appeal to the political interests of each side and don't see themselves as too partisan, so maybe they can pull down some useful stuff. But I don't know that I would mistrust a local leader who seems overly oriented towards what he or she can get from the federal government. Yeah. So do you want to?
No, why don't we take I have a really...
You're done with that question?
No, I have a really... Let me do a really quick story. During the height of the bankruptcy, I get a call from Gene Sperling, head of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama.
And a Detroit native.
And a Detroit native. And basically, Gene says, look, we can't forgive your bonds. We can't get anything, pardon me, through the Congress. But we think we might be able to exercise some administrative authorities to be helpful to you. Can we come to Detroit to announce something? And I said, what do you want to announce? He said, well, I don't know, but yeah.
Something cool.
I said, so why don't give us a couple of weeks. We'll frame up 4 or 5 things that we think would be really helpful from the federal administration. We did that, sent it to him. He had a bunch of us come to Washington. We sat in a room that, unbeknownst to me, was going to be every single cabinet member of the Obama administration was there. And we went through the list, and they started identifying where Columbus had turned back some money for police vests, where someone else had turned back some money for bus repairs. And we created this package. And at the end of the day, the Obama administration, in conjunction with Philanthropy, created an almost $300 million package that absolutely put its finger on the scales of how we were going to come out of the bankruptcy. So the current administration notwithstanding, the federal government can be enormously helpful, but it's got to be sort of taking its cues, to Jennifer's point, from the certification of need and the certification of possibility from the ground level up. And that's where a congressman could be a perfect translator, right? Absolutely. You didn't need Philanthropy to do that. It should have been a congressman.
And Carla, now you've got a question.
Hi, I come from San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Hi.
So I'm very interested in what you talked about, philanthropy, creating the scaffolding. Mm-hmm. And how do you get there? Do you need an organization leading the charge, or how do you get philanthropy, especially when you're in bankruptcy and under hurricane, to get you there?
Wow, what a good question. Let me say that we felt that we had no choice. We were large enough, we were based in Detroit, and we felt that we had the resources to essentially create some of these early moves. But having said that, there was an enormous amount of criticism early on, basically saying that's not your role. You shouldn't be, I mean, what in heaven's name is a philanthropy doing building a rail system for a municipality? That's crazy. And we got similar criticisms all along. You know, what's the use of not being accountable if you don't use it, right? My sense is that...
It's the tweet of the session.
Yeah, right. My sense is that that if you step forward, people actually will join you if they think you're on the right path, and they'll sit it out if they think you're not. And so nothing magical about it. You just have to sort of take your cues from community, say, here are the 6 things that we know we need, and then I think begin assembling resources around it. The reason I'm hesitating is Puerto Rico is so hard. Because I've asked, where is the Puerto Rican Community Foundation? Where is national philanthropy in helping Puerto Rico get back on its feet? And so I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I think it's a little bit of a shame on us all that we haven't figured out how to collectively take those kinds of risks. Because at the end of the day, philanthropy can help table set for really difficult issues. It can ask questions that the public sector is reluctant to. It can take risk in you know, it's sort of society's social venture capital. It can contribute to community problem-solving capacity, and it can help steward the sort of the fragility of the resources that no one else is going to invest in: human services, the arts, food systems, water systems, whatever it is. And so I think there is a role for philanthropy in these sort of really difficult times of extremity, but someone's just got to step up. It's a little bit about individual leadership, individual institutional leadership, and I'm not quite sure why that hasn't happened in Puerto Rico. I wish I did.
So we are officially out of time, but just one short question. Oh, yeah, one short question from Ellen, and which I hope will have a short answer, and then you can go to your next round of ideas.
Sorry.
No,
Thanks.
No, don't.
So I've been struck listening to you by how similar a lot of the issues are, especially with some of the questions, to, I was based out of Kenya for a bunch of years. And in developing countries, a lot of the things we're facing have been faced. And I'm curious from either mayors or large philanthropies, how much we look to lessons of success or failure in places like Nairobi or developing countries who have a lot of the problems we're beginning to face.
Wow, that's a hallway conversation. But maybe just very quickly, I'm about to get on a plane to go to South Africa, where Kresge works in the higher education sphere to try to ensure that students, where there is universal access to the post-secondary system, but a 2% completion rate. It's crazy. And someone said, well, why would you work in South Africa? Well, think of what South Africa has done through racial reconciliation, through race relations, through sort of the birthing of a very different kind of participatory democracy with all of its warts, all of its flaws. I think as you scroll from place to place to place, the ability to learn in ways that you never thought you would is actually profound. And I think we now go to South Africa thinking we have much more to learn from them than they do from us. So you're absolutely right. There is this sort of strange wall that drops in philanthropy between international philanthropy and domestic philanthropy. I think very few of our domestic philanthropies actually look abroad to sort of see what they can learn and export. And I'm sorry, I'm not being able to answer these questions. I don't know why. It seems so basic that in some ways there is a sort of a cross-braiding of challenges and of responses and of strategic innovation that we all should learn from.
Thank you. This has been kind of like a graduate level seminar in contemporary urban issues. Thank you for your presence, your attention. I hope your tweets, and look forward to seeing you around at the Rest of the Ideas Festival.